For me, living well has evolved into being able to do the best I can to pull together the seemingly impossible strands of my life and the different colors of the threads that weave in and out of my life into a tapestry that makes sense so that I don't feel like a victim of my life, but not necessarily a master of my life, but so that I feel that I can flow with my life.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Reflections on Living Well podcast, where we explore perspectives on the good life in the 21st century. I am your host, Broderick Rodell. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Reflections on Living Well podcast. Today, our guest is Suzanne Arms. Suzanne is an international speaker, teacher, author, photojournalist, visionary, and grassroots activist for progressive social change. For nearly 50 years, Suzanne has been a respected and familiar name to many women, parents, midwives, and healthcare activists around the world because of her 7 groundbreaking books, films, photographs, the hundreds of keynote talks she's given at conferences on 5 continents. In 1975, her second book, Immaculate Deception, A New Look at Women and Childbirth, was named a New York Times Best Book of the Year and ignited a movement. Her work and focus on Birthing the Future, the nonprofit charity she founded, centers around the primal period, the roots of love and violence, preventing early trauma, and creating peaceful, healthy societies. The key, she teaches, is to transform how we bring humans into the world and hardwire the brain to empower women and foster strong mother-baby bonds so that we can become a species based in trust and cooperation rather than fear, defense, aggression, illness, loneliness, and despair. Hi, Suzanne. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. It's good to be on. It's so funny hearing somebody talk about you. You know, when you've lived for 80 years, it always sounds like you've done so much, but when you're actually in the midst of living it, you're in the midst of projects that fail, all kinds of things that happen that don't look so good until someone
Yeah.
writes a resume looking backwards.
Yeah. You've accomplished quite a few things in this life. And I mean, that's a big lesson, isn't it? That, a life is full of successes and but also full of failures. And
Yeah.
we, and I guess one can look at those failures as a part of the success, the process of success, of living a
Yes.
successful
I
life
remember
or a good
Stuart
life.
Brand, who did the Whole Earth catalog, said fail early and fail often.
Right?
And I think
Yeah.
he's right. And we have so much fear of failure that a lot of times we, all of us, have a hard time just going for what it is we want to do because we're so afraid we're not going to make it or not get an audience.
Yeah, I know. I know. I'm about to hit 50 very soon in the next week or so. And and I've been reflecting, I mean throughout my 40s, reflecting like, man, I failed quite a bit. All these things I thought I was going to do, the things didn't turn out quite like I thought they were going to turn out. It's been an interesting life thus far, but there's been a lot of
Mm-hmm.
success in the process as well. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So
It's
I go ahead. So I just read that bio. Can you say a little bit more about yourself? I'd like for people to share a little bit more about themselves. Because the bio you had was, I mean, I
well.
can't wait for this
Um,
conversation, but I think I would love to hear what you have to say.
I live in Boulder, Colorado. I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area for 29 years. Then I moved to and lived in a little town called Durango, Colorado. Um, uh, and that was for 29 years. And then my husband and I had to move to a lower altitude because Durango was 7,300 feet. So we moved back to where he used to work in Boulder. And so I'm living in a a duplex across from a beautiful park where a lot of people do paragliding, and
Hmm.
I'm not able to, I'm not sure I ever would have done it, but I walk around that park as often as I can and also, keep as fit as I can. I don't know if people see it, but I have a heart monitor on here because I had a major surgery last year and then radiation, and I'm very weary a lot of the time. And the doctors are trying to figure out what it is. And I'm
Hmm.
one of these fortunate people whose husband figured out how to get me good uh, healthcare insurance. And every time I go to the doctor or a nurse practitioner, I am grieving over the fact that so many people don't get any health care in a country
Yeah.
that's the wealthiest in the world. So it's a huge social issue for me that I'm fortunate to be able to even have a GoFundMe account for friends to support me in doing alternative medicine, so called, which is just natural medicines. So
Hmm.
that's me, and I have had an unusual life. I think everybody has, but my life has had several strands that sometimes go apart and sometimes weave together. And it's only after the age of 40 that I started to recognize that, in fact, what looked like failures and traumas and what looked like impossibilities, given my nature, um, were actually important things that my soul needed in order to do the work I came to do. So,
Hmm.
one strand of my life has been healing myself and my family of origin trauma, sexual trauma from my father for many years. Um, the crazy making fact that he loved me and abused me, the fact that my mother loved me but also loved him and wouldn't leave him, the fact that they were both extremely bright and lived pretty much in their head, and that my father was in World War II and was one of the infantry men that opened up the concentration camps after the dead, the living had been taken out. So when he went into the concentration camp that he went into, it was just dead bodies, often naked, you know, bodies of girls that had been raped and women. And he came back from war with a great deal of trauma that was combined with ancestral trauma, family trauma, his own early trauma, and he brought it back to us. So that's
Hmm.
one strand of my life, has been this being compelled to do my own healing. I didn't have a choice. Um, and as I got older and older, started looking at it as a journey into consciousness. Then another strand of my life is is the fact that I wanted to make a difference in the world, and that my soul came here to do a piece of work, and it was social activism. And I can remember at the age of about 10, because I really didn't start out very conscious. Some people do. People like Mozart who started out already brilliant and able to do music. It took me a long time. I tell people I started at the bottom rung of the ladder. At any rate, at age 10 or so, I remember saying to myself, I am going to make the world safe for children or die trying. And at that
Hmm.
point, I, I was completely separated from the trauma my father was um, doing to me. I had no conscious knowledge of what he was doing. And it wasn't until late in my 30s that I started actually having the memories. So there's my personal journey, and then there's the journey to make a difference in the world, which is difficult when you're someone who carries trauma and who has a condition they call bipolar, which means mood swings, and I can't. I've worked for years with traditional medicines, natural medicines, yoga, meditation, tai chi, um, in addition to trying out some Western medicine for depression. to modulate my mood swings. Because when I look at people online who have their schedule planned out for the next 3 years, their teaching schedule or speaking around the world, I go, wow, that's amazing. I have no idea where I'll be then. I have no idea whether that particular set of days or weeks I'll be in a major depression. So
Mm.
that said, that's a little bit about me as a person. I have a daughter, and I have a partner. I've been married a number of times, and it took me this long to both find somebody with whom I had the kind of connection to do the work of marriage, and who had done a great deal of his own work, even though he carried a lot of trauma. So that's me. And I just had my 80th birthday, and some days I feel pretty old, and some days I feel 12.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing so much of that. Your life history, I think I can imagine how that has informed your view on what living well means. So I'm sure we'll probably, maybe some of that stuff will come back up as we continue along this conversation.
Sure.
So what does living well mean to you, or what is a good life?
Well, it's something that has evolved over the years. And I should say that I'm really interested in psychological systems that help people like me understand themselves and understand others. So I've been an armchair student of astrology for many years. I understand the Enneagram, and I'm just really curious about what makes me tick and what makes other people tick. And I find out that these kinds of systems are really whole. Whatever system it is, it's a whole system, and it works. Whether it's astrology based on the Vedic dates in India or whether it's Western astrology, I find it fascinating. So, having said that, I for anybody who knows anything about the Enneagram, I'm a number 7 on the Enneagram. It's the last number I wanted to be. That's what they say you usually are. And I always thought it was a dilettante. I'm not so much a dilettante as a magpie. I pull together strands from um, different modalities, different ways of looking at the world, different kinds of research and evidence and personal and experience and observations. And it's I envy people who can go really deep and stay with something all their life, because although I've stayed with this issue, it is a birth, it has expanded and deepened as I've grown, and I'm constantly learning new stuff. And that said, um, I am an Aries, a last degree Aries. I have no earth in my chart to speak of. I'm a Pisces rising, Pisces moon. And the more I understood about astrology, the more it informed me that my core nature, because that's what the natal chart is, it's what your soul came in to be at its essence. Are you a wildflower? Are you a daisy? Are you a lily? Are you a pine tree? Well, I'm in Aries with Pisces rising, Pisces moon, which means I'm an activist, I'm a go-getter, I'm passionate, I am pushy, I I'm dogmatic when I'm talking about something, even though I don't know all of it, and I change my mind when I get new information. I sound like sometimes a know-it-all. And I'm a dreamer and an idealist and a filmmaker and a dancer. That's all of the Pisces with great deal of empathy, whereas the Aries is very self-referenced. If nobody's going to follow me into the battle, I'll go my own and do it on my own. So learning these kinds of things about myself has helped a great deal. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. Yeah, so it's helping you see and have a sense of what living well means. So can you say a little
Yeah,
more?
that's
What?
what the question was. So for
Oh,
me,
it's okay.
living well has evolved into being able to do the best I can to pull together the seemingly impossible strands of my life and the different colors of the threads that weave in and out of my life into a tapestry that makes sense, so that I don't feel like a victim of my life, but not necessarily a master of my life, but so that I feel that I can flow with my life and accept what I can't change, the whole 12-step thing, and change what I can. And to me, living well means body, intellect, psychology, emotions, feelings, and spirit. And I was lucky because even though my father was away at World War II when I was born, 1944, when there were a lot of bad outcomes of battles in Europe, and my mother was taking that all in as a pregnant woman, she danced with me when I was a baby. She held me in my arms. She told me this and danced with me. And my mother was a very kind of aloof Aquarian with Capricorn moon, so there was a sternness to her. She was a great teacher, but even though her body was very soft and cuddly, she didn't show that a lot. But she danced with me, and I became a dancer in my 20s, and then carried through, starting in San Francisco with studying African dance and then African drumming. And of course, I'm not a dancer anymore, but living well means to me living in my body and accepting who I am, which has not been easy. Accepting the fact that I can walk into a room and people can take an instant dislike to me if I start talking, or they can be totally attracted to me. And people have told me over the years that I'm in their dreams, or they idealize me. It's either one or the other. They either like the Pisces malleable, soft, gentle, compassionate side, or they like the strong Aries side. But they don't usually see both, and the fact that I have to live with both. So living well for me is more and more finding a way of dynamic balance among all the different parts of me, and not pushing any of them out, not wishing that I were something that I'm not, and it also has meant having a connection to my spirit and my soul, which I see as two separate things. And I'm not quite sure what the difference really is, but I feel that our soul comes in with a purpose, what in some cases, in some situations, in some cultures is called like a suchness. It just is who you are. That's totally separate from the DNA and the who you are that is a result of how you were conceived, how you were birthed, the environment in the womb, and all of that. So there's these different influences operating. And then there's your spirit, which is connected to the divine and the earth, ideally. And for me, it's meant a real connection to indigenous cultures, and ironically, not Native American cultures, but African, indigenous African cultures, even though I don't sense that I ever in another life was Black. I think I was a midwife herbalist in medieval Europe, but that's kind of as far back as, oh no, that's not true. I think I was a temple dancer in India. So it's living well means pulling all of these pieces together, and then also not taking oneself that seriously, so that I can recognize I am a piece of the whole, but I can't exist without the whole. And I'm nourished by the whole. And that there will always be mystery. Um, and, I don't believe in a personal God. I believe in a great mystery, and much more like a lot of tribes in Africa, and the belief that um, everything, everything is divine, everything is sacred, that light, that mysterious, incredible power is in trees and frogs and the guy down the street who's masturbating in public who you can't stand. I mean, all of it. It's all quite amazing. And that said, I'm extremely judgmental. And I've had to work on that my entire life. That I form opinions very fast. I'm facile. I learn quick, and I'm a writer, and I'm a filmmaker and a photographer. So I make decisions quickly, and I'm very judgmental. Oh, I don't like what she's wearing there. She really needs to lose about 30 pounds. And I can go there. And am learning to accept the fact that the judgment side of me has made me very good at critical thinking and very good at getting a sense of people when I first meet them and getting a sense of who I need to know. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, I love it. All of the stuff that you said is a lot there. Hopefully, we can unpack a little bit of that, and I love how you're, and it's an important piece of the puzzle for you is being able to integrate all these aspects of ourselves,
Before we die.
and exactly. Yes, we're trying to create some resonance, some harmony of all of these different facets or aspects of who we are.
Yeah.
And I love how you bring up there are various models out there, systems models for looking at the mind and looking at one's self, one's nature, be it astrology, East, West, Indian astrology, Western astrology. I know there people that they're like, oh, that's just BS. It doesn't
I
predict
know.
anything. I'm like,
Looking at
yeah, that's not
dreams, Carl Jung's work, I love Jung. There are
exactly
people
all
who
of it.
write down every dream they ever have. Well, I don't do that. I did it a little bit, but I'm too lazy. But I do
Yeah.
think dreams are really important. My husband doesn't agree.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that there are different ways and different systems. Some people might just take the various psychological, psychotherapeutic models out there with different ways of looking at the mind. Some people might focus on mostly materialistic. For me, I think what's important is whatever systems we use, we're trying to make sense of who we are. We're trying to make sense of all these aspects, these capacities that we have, and
And
then
make
figure it
sense of,
out.
and make sense of the world.
Exactly. Exactly. And make sense of how we and all these aspects and facets of ourselves integrate with the world. And then also trying to figure out how do I integrate these pieces inside of me,
Mm.
these aspects of me, these parts, and see if I can integrate with the world and its various facets and parts. So there's a lot of complexity there that's involved. And I love how you said that also that this is a lifelong process. It's just this process of discovering and understanding more about what living well means because we're in the process of understanding and discovering more about ourselves in the world, and getting to know intimately who we are so
If
we can find out what our purpose
if
is.
we're fortunate enough to have enough
Exactly.
food, if we're fortunate enough to be able to have safety, physical safety, if we're
Yeah.
fortunate enough to be able to come in out of the cold into a warm place in the winter, if we're fortunate enough to have people who care about us. And, when I look at so many people who struggle, they may never get to the point of having the luxury of the time it takes to do the journey, the deep dive into their own self and into consciousness and exploring things that don't have anything to do with the fact that they're working in an automobile factory or they're pushing a broom at a school, because they're barely able to get through the day with whatever helps them, whether it's a beer or a television show or whatever. I mean, you and I
Mhm.
are fortunate.
Exactly. And I think you're touching on another thing there. Like, yes, all of these things are great to do this deep dive inside of ourselves. And I think it's important. I think it's available to all of us. And also, we need to consider that there are some conditions that are favorable for doing such a thing.
Yes.
And if you have the material means, meaning that you have your basic needs met, then you free up a little more energy and space to do that. But another big piece of this that I think gets lost is the way the nature of our culture, the narrative that we live in, the story that we live in, and people are, though it's changed and evolved, it's different now than it was, say, 50 years ago or 60, 70 years ago. But we still live in a world where people are focused on making those ends meet, where we have to work 50, 60 hours a week just to make those ends meet. And also, now I'm not saying that needs to happen, but where I'm heading at with this is there's a we can reconsider as a society, as a culture, what it means to live together, to interact with one another, to have an economy, to have an environment where humans are interacting with each other in such a fashion that it's maximized, it's optimized, and it doesn't have to be based on the acquisition of money. It doesn't have to be the acquisition of um, the increase in our capacity to consume, just to consume for the sake of consumption, because consumption drives human interactions or drives the economy. Um, it doesn't have to be the way that it is. I think if we raise the question, because there's so much suffering in the world, when people have to work 40, 50 hours a week just to get their basic needs met,
Mm-hmm.
or their wants, and some now we have to acknowledge that too. That's an issue too. Why do we want the things that we want? Do I need 100 pair of shoes? Do I need all of this excessive stuff to consume? I'm bringing this up to just to raise a question. The way that we have structured our society, the way we interact with each other, the things that we feel like we have to do in order to survive, I think it's important that we question those things.
I think
And
so
as well,
too.
in the process of taking that deep dive inside of ourselves.
Yeah, I think so too. And often the impulse for that is pain and suffering that
Yep.
causes us to question. And also other people who influence us, people we come in contact with. And it's so important for us to recognize that this whole way of existence, the economy that we have grown, which is capitalism, which many of us think is a requirement for democracy, has nothing to do with democracy.
No.
That it's a way, it's a form of economics, but just
Mm-hmm.
like socialism is, just like communism is, just like whatever. And the two don't necessarily go together. And in fact, patriarchy is only about 8,000 years old, and we're millions of years old, or at least, yeah, millions of years old. And people didn't always live this way. In gathering hunting societies or tribes, which are usually like 12 to 15 men and women, moving from place to place. And I say gathering hunting very carefully because the women actually provided more of the food than the men did. The men took the
Mm-hmm.
risk of going out and doing the hunting, but the women were really, they were raising the children, they were doing the cooking and so on. In those societies, what we found is that the average amount of work that people put in every day was 4 hours. Now, it
Mm-hmm.
took us till what, 1920 or later for the union movement in the United States to push so hard that we ended up with not just a 60-hour work week, but then a 40-hour work week, which could actually easily be a 24-hour work week if we wanted to structure our society that way. There's all the research is there. Nobody should need to work more than 24 hours a day. But in these gathering hunting societies, they had time. They had time to tell stories. They had time to weave baskets. I mean, they had time to sit in circle and pick the knits out of their hair. They had time to draw on each other. We don't have that kind of time. And as we increase the speed at which we operate because of the technologies we've created, it seems like there's less and less time. And doing any kind of introspective work and questioning where we are, questioning why we do what we do individually, as a family, as a culture, it takes time. So yeah, it took me a long time to realize this. I had a minor in anthropology in college, and that began my journey in asking questions like, why do we do things the way we do?
Yeah.
It ended up with me as an activist in childbirth asking obstetricians, what would happen if you lived in a place where you couldn't do this cesarean? What would you do? They didn't have any answer because they hadn't grown up in any culture that had any alternatives to drugs and surgery and hospitals and that. And yet indigenous cultures and traditional cultures based on the midwife model of birth, which is the biological model of birth, and the use of herbs and keeping people well so that you didn't have to call in the medicine man when people were in extremis. Those were what was dominant. And so asking questions is very important, but that didn't come naturally to me. What came naturally to me was being docile and obedient. It's interesting because I remember reading research not too long ago that showed that there is a great deal of difference in the value system between serious conservatives and serious progressives, people on one end or the other. For progressives, the most important value in raising children is to foster their creativity and their questioning and their sense of autonomy and agency over their lives. For conservatives, and that's true of religious as well as just political conservatives, the values in raising children, the value they placed the most respect on was obedience. Yeah. Now, if obedience is what you want out of a child, it's going to result in a very different kind of human being. That child is either going to become very docile or that child is going to have the seeds of creativity and push back. And, I go attend these days the Unitarian Universalist community because their worldview encompasses all spirituality, including atheism, Buddhism, Wicca, all of it. And yet it's also very intellectual. I mean, they do a lot of serious questioning and thinking. And there is no creed, there is no theology that you have to believe in order to attend that, church. I don't like the word church, but it is interesting that in the members the people who come to this church, so many of them come from Catholic backgrounds or fundamentalist Christianity and have come to Unitarian Universalism along the way, having become gay and then bisexual and then living in a group, transsexual or maybe transvestite, and then anyway, that's where they go, when they leave fundamentalism, because they there was no way they could fully express themselves as human beings. Obedience was what they were raised to have as the sense of ethics in a society, which didn't necessarily jibe with their sense of what was right or wrong, which is morality. I just read the description between morality and ethics because I didn't really know it. And you had asked a question in the material that you sent me. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I think that, I think the asking the question is the important piece. We're not going to go back and live like our ancestors did 1,000 years ago, 2,000, well, 4,000 years ago, or even longer. What am I saying? 6,000 years ago as hunter gatherers. Yet there's something we can learn from all of that. I think we can integrate a lot of the things from our past. There's been a lot of great modern technology that has been highly beneficial, and I'm not going to get rid of that. We're using it right now, but I think that we have to think about at what price
Mm-hmm.
and for what purpose. What
Mm-hmm.
is our end goal? And I think we've been sold on this idea that if the end goal is the generation of profit or wealth, then that's going to automatically, wealth through the marketplace, it's going to automatically increase. And I'm using my terms here. It's going to automatically increase human interactions and therefore solve problems based on that model. And
Yeah.
we all know that that's not true. And I think that we can think about, when in the context of living well, how do we, because if living well is an important part of living well is making sure that people have basic needs met and there's a favorable conditions, there's time and energy that's available to do a deep dive into oneself, to find out about these different aspects of ourselves so we can find harmony and then integrate with the rest of the world. But we need to figure out a different way that we organize our society and be open to it, be open to exploring it. I don't think it's wise to get rid of all aspects of capitalism.
I mean,
Absolutely not. I don't think it's wise to get rid of all aspects of any systems that we
right.
have. But I think, how do we take, even if it's a small part, how do we take the little part out of that system that is beneficial, that can be recycled into a new system, a new way of thinking?
There's a myth that people appropriate other cultures' values and rituals and things like that, and that's a very bad thing. But if you look at it as an anthropologist, tribes have been taking from each other since the beginning of time. They have been
Yeah.
adapting, changing, in some cases, walking 100 kilometers to find a bride because in the tribe it was understood that you didn't marry within the tribe because it was dangerous to have the same. Um, they didn't understand it was genes, but yes. And so it's a myth that people have their cultures and we're trying to appropriate it. Actually, the world has been changing and appropriating and picking and choosing since the beginning of human beings. And I think, I mean, you're right. One of the things that I have learned in terms of living well over the last, really, it's only the last maybe decade, is most truth is both and, not either
Yep.
or. And we live in an either or society. That is not so true in Buddhism, Hinduism, in cultures that are from the East, like Japan and China. Um, there is an understanding of both and of paradox, that it's not just that two things that are seeming opposites can both be true. But in fact, that is the truth. And a perfect example in my work is the mother and baby. The mother and baby are two separate souls, right from conception. And yet they are one biological symbiotic unit. That baby needs the mother's nutrients through the umbilical cord that runs into the baby's body from the mother. That mother's uterus needs to contract after birth from something this size to the size of a pear. And what makes it contract is the baby licking or suckling at her breast. They need each other. And you'll
Mm-hmm.
see this symbiotic relationship in a lot of animals and a lot of plants in nature. But we have this notion of singularity, that we are isolated, separate beings. And unfortunately, that was really laid down with the Industrial Revolution, with the ability to take people off the land and to put them in factories in the hopes that we could make life easier for people, not realizing that the downside of it would be that people became slaves to the machines and they had to work 24-hour shifts or 24 hours a day in whatever form, somebody working all night, somebody working all day, separated from their kids or having kids in the factory in order to keep the machines running. So the good things that we've gotten from technology, and there are many, are really balanced and in some ways offset or not by the downside that we have become a society of consumption. You know, in a
Mm-hmm.
gathering hunting society, there is no saving of food or resources. They move from place to place and they eat a wide variety of things and they don't store anything and they carry everything with them. But once we moved from that into a society that began to have buildings that they came back to every couple of seasons as a stable place, in other words, not constantly on the move. This is before real agriculture. Then they could store things. And once human beings began to store things, the concept of greed began, because then you had to protect what you stored. And men became more important than women because their bodies were bigger and they were more likely to want to protect the stored food or whatever. Women became less significant, whereas in the beginning, for hundreds of thousands of years, men and women either did the same thing or they took different roles and then the roles switched depending on the need, but nobody was better than anybody else. The concept of hatred of women, which comes from fear of the feminine, couldn't exist in a small unit where everybody needed each other and where men were awestruck watching a woman give birth, awestruck watching a woman bleed in menstruation. And so the first statues were always of women, you know, big hipped, big breasted women. So the economic system, political system that we have, to me, goes way back to how we bring humans into the world and what a good life is and what is real wellness. And that has to do with how the brain is wired. Is it wired for peace? Is it wired for trust? Is it wired for compassion? Or is it wired for fear and defense, aggression? hopelessness and despair. And it's the modern science of epigenetics, which is only, like 30, 40 years old as a science. It's a subset of biology, shows us that at the cellular level, the cell itself, the brain of the cell is not the nucleus, which is what we thought it was, the center. It's the casing of the cell. The brain of the cell is all of the container. And that container of the cell is constantly reading the environment for an answer to one question. Is it safe? Is it safe to grow fully? And when a cell is in an environment that is conducive to full growth, it will. And when a cell is in an environment that is toxic or full of stress, it will grow in a state of defense. It will put a lot of energy into defending itself, and it can never grow fully. Now, it can go into therapy. It can do what I've done, which is spend so many hours and dollars in my life healing myself. But basically, I'd have been a different person if I didn't have all the trauma at the beginning, right? So this is really significant because we are systematically, and have for many years, been wiring the human brain and heart to fear. And we thought trust, I can remember psychology back 30 years ago saying that trust was the first lesson that human beings have to learn. No, it's not the first lesson. The baby in the womb implicitly trusts. It's the natural phenomena. Fear and defense is what happens when the environment is under stress, and right at the biological cellular level, in order to grow, it has to respond appropriately to its environment. And if the environment is hostile, then it will grow in defense. So if you see a child raised in an environment that's very toxic, that child will have a keen sense of what's safe and what's not, and is much more likely to use its fists. It's much more likely to join a gang because it doesn't have a sense of real family and community, and so the gang becomes it. Much more likely to shoot a stranger in a drive-by shooting as part of its initiation ritual, not even thinking about it, because its identity is loyalty to the tribe, to the gang. Well, what do you think people are doing politically? They are seeing themselves they don't see it this way, but people are behaving as if they're in a cult and not looking at what we are doing to democracy, and not looking at how are we going to thrive, how are we going to solve the questions of racism and poverty and inequities of all kinds, how are we going to stop wars, if in fact we are wiring the human brain to fear and defense. And what you get out of fear and defense is, on one end of the spectrum, what's called in psychology learned helplessness. That's a really important thing for people to get. Babies don't innately feel helpless. They learn helplessness. It's what happens when they cry and cry and cry. They try and communicate, and nobody responds. They will try and try until they give up, and then it's helplessness. Well, that translates years later into whether they even register to vote. Well, my vote isn't going to count anyway.
Yeah, you're bringing up all of these things that are really important. Going back to what you're saying about, again, the environment, the conditions that a child is born into, a human being is brought into this world into, the context of the child's birth. all of these different things, and you can look at that in terms of our history as a species, earlier phases of our history. What was the environment like? What were the conditions? How did the environment, the conditions mold and shape the human being, which is going to influence and impact their subsequent actions, behaviors, which is going to shape their narrative, and then the various psychological factors that we are all unaware of, that are subconscious, that are driving our behaviors and actions. We can do a lot to create favorable conditions and help to develop the
Yeah.
brain of a young child such that as they mature, they can more likely live a good life. They can more likely live well, because those conditions are really important. And it's incumbent on us adults, those of us who are in the world, having conversations like this, exploring what it means, exploring how do we make a world where it is favorable for the human beings within it to live a good life, to live well. Not to say we are going to find all the solutions by having this conversation, but we can at least explore it and gain some insight by exploring these ideas and trying to make sense of it. And I think I'm with you on, the conditions that a child is brought up in, the environment that they're brought up in, definitely informs their life, informs their behaviors, their actions for the rest of their life.
Yeah, and it's the whole reason that I continue after half a century in this work, this pre and perinatal work, from preconception to age 1 being the most formative, is that this is the foundation. And
Yeah.
it's so much easier to get the foundation right and getting it solid than it is to correct it later. It's so much more costly to do it later and takes so much more time and effort. An analogy I often use is the tree called the cypress, which grows at the edge of the Pacific in California, and it grows according to the wind, and it's all deformed in its shape, and it's beautiful if you look at it that way. But basically, it's been shaped by very difficult conditions, not enough water, and too much wind. So if you have a garden and you plant a seed, that seed in the very beginning needs light and nourishment and just enough warmth in the soil or whatever medium it's in to grow. Now, it also needs stress, but if you stress it too soon, it will never grow. And it's the same thing with a human being. And perfect example of that is the stress hormones, the most notorious of which is adrenaline. If we stress a baby in the womb or at conception, that baby is conceived in rape, or the mother is starving because of war while she's pregnant with the baby, or has a traumatic birth, or whatever. If we conceive in stress, then that seed has a much harder time growing to what its soul really was meant to be. Can you correct it? Yes, you can, sometimes. The earlier you work with healing trauma, the more you identify something as trauma, if it was, in other words, a need that wasn't met for the childbearing woman, or something that was shocking and traumatic and abusive, those are both trauma, then you can do something to correct it. But as long as we have what's known as normative abuse, normative neglect, in other words, this is accepted in the culture as being the norm, then you're not going to address it. When I grew up in the 40s, babies were fed artificial formula, and the formula did not have anything like the nutrients that a baby needed and got from a mother's breast milk or from the sensations of being naked and up against the mother's breast with its mouth and having its teeth and jaw shaped by this drawing the milk out of her breast, which is a very different thing than sucking on a bottle, right? So when I was born, the standard was to prop the bottle up with a quilted, weighted bottle holder. It was something that was heavyweight, and then it had this loop around it. The bottle went in the loop, and then the mother laid that bottle holder on the baby's chest, put the baby on its back, and the baby learned fairly quickly how to grab the bottle, and then over time how to bring it to its face and get milk, so that the mother could do what she was expected to do, which is cook or do the laundry or whatever it was. That's a far cry from meeting the need of a baby for nourishment. And that's what we are doing systematically in our medical technological hospital approach to childbirth. We've got a 33% cesarean rate when major surgery for childbirth shouldn't be more than 4 to 6%. We've got 60% of women going into labor artificially induced. In other words, the attempt is to start labor too early to fit the medical model of when a baby should be born, or to speed it up. That's 60% of all births. And then we've got maybe 90% of women having drugs, epidurals to numb, or sedatives to numb the pain. And we put women on their back in bed. And it was years into my work in birth before I learned that biologically, when you put a woman on her back in bed in labor, the contractions last longer, hurt more, and are less effective. So why did we do this? For the convenience of the staff, i.e. the male doctors, because it used to be all male doctors. So, so much of what we do has nothing to do with biological appropriateness. And that's not to say that medicine and surgery don't have their place. Western medicine is the best in the world in microsurgery, in reconstructing a face that's been burned off, in all kinds of amazing things. But when it comes to bringing a human being into the world, man, have we got it wrong. The midwife model is the biological model. You do what nature is asking for. You don't induce labor. You don't make it go when you want it to happen. You don't try and speed it up. You observe very carefully to make sure that what's happening is within the parameters of normal. And normal is a broad spectrum. But in Western medicine, it's a very narrow construct. If you're not dilating, if your cervix is not opening 1 centimeter an hour, that's an abnormality. No, it's not. It can take 10 hours for it to dilate 1 centimeter and then go to 10. So it's a complete misunderstanding about how nature works. And that we go from there to women going back to work too soon. Fewer than 20% of American babies are exclusively breastfed at 6 weeks of age. They should be exclusively breastfed till 6 months or even 9 months, and not weaned until at least 2.5 to 4. And boys need more breastfeeding and more cuddling than girls, because biologically girls are built for survival of the species, and boys are more vulnerable. So you have more boys dying in the intensive care premature baby unit. Nurses know this. Nature creates more boy babies than girls because more babies die when they're boys. Boys are more vulnerable to trauma if the father, and this is new research, if the father's under a great deal of stress in the weeks before his sperm conceive a baby, that baby, if it's a boy, is much more likely than if it's a girl to have difficulty growing fully. It's much more likely to be born prematurely or low birth weight. It's much more likely to act out high risk behavior as a toddler.
Mm-hmm.
So, we are taking the most vulnerable parts of the species, which are our boys, and we're training them to be warriors. And when I see boys in football onesies, 10-pound boys in their little onesie outfit that's a football thing, or a camouflage outfit for hunting, or a military outfit, which you see, that's what mothers put them in, then we are training boys to be cannon fodder, to die in war. That's where it all connects. That's where how we bring humans in and why we end up with the nightmarish destruction of life that goes on around the world, mostly from men and women who've been trained in the patriarchal model, and mostly because these men at the start of their life have not gotten their needs fully met. When I look at these men, these so-called leaders of the world, most of them have serious attachment disorders. They didn't get the mothering, and by saying mothering, it can be provided by a grandmother, by a father, by a person who's changed genders, but the quality of nurturing called mothering, and the responsiveness to that child, and the curiosity of the intellect, and giving that child information, those three things, nurturing, responsiveness, and informative. When that child didn't get it, it's much more likely to grow up to be a Hitler. And we deal
Yeah, I
with
think.
that every day, and we can't get paid maternity leave because people on one side of the spectrum politically say that's, quote, sucking off the tit. Meanwhile, we will give subsidies to people who grow pigs or corn. That's not sucking off the tit. But because it's a woman, because it has to do with nurturing, and because it's the female breast, that's what it's called. That's why we don't have paid maternity leave. It goes down very deep in patriarchy, is this fear of and hatred of all things vulnerable, all things tender, all things feminine. And what's more vulnerable than a human infant at the breast or Mother Nature? So we rape nature in the name of profit. And that's why I stay with this issue, because I want to see the foundation laid for people to thrive and to have a good life and be able to question what is going on around them and not be victims of learned helplessness, to have a sense of agency over their lives. And if you and I talked about what happened in your life to result in you as a Black man in America having a sense of agency in your life and getting the education you had, I mean, we would see it at the beginning of your life. There were circumstances that helped you, in addition to cultural and racial and socioeconomic things from your heritage, whatever that is, your ancestral stuff. I mean, you had a lot of ingredients that go into making a Broderick.
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to a man who became a gang member, sold marijuana, and was in a state that had 3 strikes you're out, and ended up in prison for 50 years, who was as intelligent as you, but never had the chance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we're at the hour mark here, and I think you really I loved it. I think you really hit on the nail about how this notion of creating those favorable conditions and why, and looking at it from a cultural perspective and looking at how we are raised, how we are brought into this world, and how that's informed by the cultural habits that are unhealthy, irrational, really. And I applaud you on your fight.
Normative abuse.
That's norm. I know, right? It's
Isn't that a
become
great term?
normalized,
Yeah,
right?
normative abuse.
Yeah,
It's
yeah. It's
considered
become
normal.
normal. Yeah, it's like, yeah, this is what we do. This is the way it is, and you're trying to fix. We're not gonna try. We're trying to fix it. We won't try to transform it into something else. And we were trying to refine it. I'm like, no, let's not refine that. Let's try to figure out a different way of doing things. And I think that just hearing you articulate that and share your passion about this, and I think it's so important because I think that you kind of brought it full circle there. That what the culture that we are embedded in, how that culture informs how we bring a life into this world, and that life that we bring into the world is um, going to uh, um, the prospects of that life that's brought into this world is going to be affected by the cultural conditions, our cultural narrative that has been imposed on the family, that the family has adopted. We need to take a look at all of that. I think that's what I take from what you're just saying. We need to take a really close look at that because I think what you're saying is correct. That the way we're doing things now needs to be reevaluated. And if we don't, then we're going to the violence that we see in the world, the harm that we see to doing that is done to nature, the amount of people who are not living well, who are not living a good life. It's going to continue down this path unless we make a considerable change in how we see things and how we are doing things as a
I
culture.
really feel it only takes one generation to shift the world. Maybe I'm being
Mm.
naive, but if we had one generation in which 30-40% of human beings were well born from preconception to age 1, they got most of their needs met, they would become a force for introspection, for cooperation, for creating community, for creativity that would be unstoppable. You know,
I admire your optimism because in one generation I've
one
given up on the one.
generation. Yeah,
Wow, that's very optimistic. I hope that you will. That would be great if that comes true.
yeah.
Yeah. So we're coming to a close here. Are there any final words that you would like to share with us before we sign off?
Well, I guess what I'd like to let people know who are listening or watching is that you have within you a seed, potential, your soul that came into this world whole. Anything terrible that's happened to you has not touched that core of who you are. Now, to get to it, to get back to it, means a whole bunch of crap has to be cleared out of the way. The weeds have to be pulled. And it involves work. And this is not easy. People who choose the path of healing, the path of consciousness, are well aware that this is, once you start on this path, it's a journey that A, you can't go back. You can't become unconscious when you started to be conscious. And B, it takes effort and time, and it's painful. It's painful. But it is so worth it to discover who you came to be. Maybe you came, I mean, as you did, you started out, you went to be a chemical engineer. You got your PhD, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then discovered there was something else that was really deep inside you wanting to grow. Well, that was always there, but there were all kind of circumstances that caused you to go in that particular direction. And I want people to know that that piece of themselves that's covered over, that with all kinds of wounds and all kinds of things that give us reason to feel we are victims and have been, can be changed. And that the story of our lives is not done until it's done. You know, the saying that the opera isn't over till the fat lady sings.
Yeah.
I want people to recognize their innate worth and to seek out people and circumstances that make them feel valued and seen, and to start to turn away from and say no to the television shows, the YouTube videos, the people in their lives who make them feel bad. And we are all these incredible, incredible, unique beings who live in a world of relationship. We're not meant to live alone. We're meant to have people and circumstances around us to tell us, to remind us who we are. And I want to give one example from a tribe in Africa called the Dogara people. Have I got time for it?
Sure. A few minutes.
Okay, I knew a woman named Sobonfu Some, whose husband was Malidoma Some. They came
Mm-hmm.
from a Dogara tribe in Burkina Faso, one of the poorest countries in the world, high infant mortality. I'm saying not everything was perfect in this tribe, harsh circumstances, but they had a belief system that every child came into the world from the world of the ancestors beyond, carrying a gift that was absolutely essential to the well-being and thriving of the tribe. And it was the responsibility of the entire tribe, not the biological parents, because in fact, these children often didn't know who their biological parents were, because they spent their days wandering as toddlers from hut to hut, whoever had the best smelling food. Somebody was angry, they went to another hut, you know? They weren't sequestered with frustrated, exhausted, angry parents, right? So the whole tribe's responsibility was to make sure that this child was raised in such a way that it could give its gifts. And as that child grew, when it came to a place where it made bad decisions and did things that were counter to the well-being of the tribe, they didn't have any police in that tribe. There were no judges. There were no jails. There were rituals. And in a ritual that brought together the whole tribe through the drumming and the chanting that called in everybody, that child or that teenager or adult was placed in the center of the circle, and everybody knew that child or that teenager or adult and started telling that child what they knew about his innate goodness or her innate goodness. They literally flooded that child's consciousness with how wonderful you are as a human being. To bring that child or that adult or teenager back to remembering who they really were. Doesn't that sound wonderful?
Yes. Beautiful.
It's it's doable.
Awesome. Thank you so much for
Thank
sharing your wisdom with us today. Thank you so much. And I do look forward to talking with you more and exploring with you more. I appreciate you taking this time to come onto the show and share your wisdom, your
Oh,
knowledge, your life
it's been
experience.
fun. I love watching your face and listening to you talk. And if people want to know more about me, they can go to my nonprofit website, birthingthefuture.org. And bless you, Broderick, in what you're doing. I'm so grateful.
Thank you so much for tuning into the show. I hope this conversation has inspired you to reflect on your own views of the good life. If you enjoyed the show and want to hear more inspiring and thought-provoking conversations, please follow, write a review, and rate us on your favorite podcast app. If you are tuning in on YouTube, please hit that like button and subscribe. Your support is very much appreciated.